Oh, how quickly the mood can shift in Tehran. Tear gas and live rounds allegedly fired as a third day of protests have Iran's government on the back foot over the accidental downing of a Ukrainian airliner. This was last week, hours after the Revolutionary Guards fired missiles on coalition bases in Iraq in retaliation for the U.S. killing senior commander Qassem Suleimani. A week ago, we were wondering if Donald Trump had just handed his adversaries a free pass by getting a nation torn apart a month earlier by the deadly crackdown over fuel hike protests to then rally round the flag. Now the gripes of ordinary Iranians over mismanagement and lack of accountability are back to the fore. We'll ask our panel what prompted authorities to first deny, then admit the shooting down of Ukraine International Airlines flight PS752. What will be the fallout? The Iranians aren't the only ones told to get their stories straight. Donald Trump's defense secretary rolling back an earlier admission that there was no hard evidence that Qassem Suleimani was about to target the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad when the Quds Force commander was killed. What to expect next from the U.S. administration's maximum pressure policy, and what to make of mediation efforts to ward off a repeat of last week's escalation that had the whole world on edge. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the pressure on Iran and on the wider region. With us, Georges Melbruno, senior correspondent for French daily newspaper Le Figaro. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
Want to welcome as well Azadeh Kian, professor of political science at the University of Paris. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to Abbas Aslani from Tehran, senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies.
Thank you.
And from Washington, D.C., Matthew Kronig. He teaches at Georgetown University. Your latest book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy, from the Ancient World to the U.S. and China. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, a third day of protests in Iran with university campuses the focal point. Peter O'Brien has more.
It's been 3 days since the Iranian government revealed the Ukraine International Airlines plane was brought down by a missile, and public anger shows no signs of abating.
I don't think it was a simple mistake. Nearly 200 people were killed.
I don't know why they didn't cancel the flights that night. I think the National Security Council should have made that decision, and they didn't.
Protests continued on Monday after a weekend of unrest which saw demonstrators chant slogans against Iran's leadership. According to eyewitness reports, authorities have responded not only with tear gas, but also with live ammunition, leaving several injured. This has been denied by the police. Last week, Tehran launched a wave of missiles at American troops in Iraq in retaliation for the US killing of a top Iranian general. The passenger jet was struck hours later. It took 3 days for the government to reveal the truth about the plane, whose passengers were mostly Iranians. It has denied a cover-up.
Some government officials have been accused of lying and covering up. That was honestly not the case.
President Hassan Rouhani has promised a thorough investigation. Adding to international pressure, 5 nations whose citizens died in the disaster will meet on Thursday to discuss possible legal action.
And before we go to our panel, let's go to Tehran and France 24 correspondent Catalina Gomez Angel. Catalina, how big were the protests this Monday?
I think the protests today were smaller and more concentrated in universities, but still the same slogans as yesterday. We have to say that yesterday, when we walked with these demonstrators towards Meydan Azadi or the Azadi Square, most of them were young people. Some of them were with their parents or people older, but most of them were this young generation that really feel abandoned and betrayed by this regime. They say that they have been attacking this young generation. They feel that they could have been the same people who were in the plane. We have to remind that most of these people were students, or they were young generation that had studied in these best universities in Tehran, and they tried to search for a better life in Canada. Then the anger of these people are huge, and I think they are losing their fear. I mean, it was not easy to walk yesterday in Tehran. There was extremely high security, a lot of besiegers with the tear gas, with the rubber bullets, but still these people tried to do their best to gather and to chant that slogans that were not soft slogans. I mean, they were saying, you are killing the elite, and you put them mullahs in behalf, or we don't want a government led by the Revolutionary Guards. It's something very strong, but it looks like they were telling us we are not fair anymore. We want to fight for our life because otherwise we don't have any future.
And the government promising there will be an investigation.
Yeah, but I don't think people are buying that this moment in Tehran. I mean, people, especially the middle class, this middle class educated, that for 10 years, many people have lost their hopes to go to the street. I mean, you have to remember that these last two big demonstrations at the end of 2017 and the one we saw in November was more lit by this middle, lower class people, more from the suburbs and the rural areas where not opportunities. This middle educated class were not hoping to go to the streets anymore because they said it was not worth to lose their life. But now they don't believe in the government. They believe that nobody cares about their life. Nobody cares about what they are doing to do in the future. Then I don't think there is any hope in among the society about this investigation.
All right, many thanks for that update. Catalina Gomez Angel, let's get the reaction of the panel. Begin with you, Abbas Aslani, in Tehran. Many people were surprised that first, when there was this about face on Saturday by the government owning up to the shooting down of the plane. How do you explain that?
Well, in order to give a authentic picture, I would say that on Wednesday when the plane crashed, that was a kind of shock to the public and a disaster as well. But at the beginning of the incident, the officials, mostly the civil officials, they insisted that it was according to a technical problem. But after somehow some 3 days, there was an official statement from the armed forces in the country saying that happened as a result of an unintentional shut down by a missile as well. And this came as a second tragedy for the public, and that was the moment that we saw the public more upset than a couple of days ago. And this brought the feeling that maybe the government wanted to conceal the fact from the grieving public for days. That is one thing, and that was a kind of blow for the social trust in the society. But on the other side, there are also officials who are saying that they needed some time in order to, let's say, process the information and to reach a level of certainty that how this incident happened. And they were saying that they needed some time to reach a conclusion. And as soon as they reached that conclusion, they tried to inform the public, and this has been the cause of this situation and scattered protests in the capital city and some other cities as well. And today I was hearing something new as well, and they were saying maybe the incident which happened and it was shut down by a missile that might come as a result of maybe a electronic warfare or cyber attack, which made that the operator using that air defense system to think that was a cruise missile rather than a passenger airplane. And some are arguing maybe Americans have done cyber attack in order to deceive the operator and to make him shot at a passenger plane. And these are part of also the argument among the officials that they are saying maybe a system, there might be a system hacking by the enemy, or let's say a jamming has happened, and they have said that they need to continue the investigation. And I think if that is the case, that Americans have made the Iranian operator to shoot at the passenger plane, I think that can add more, let's say, some dimensions to the issue.
All right,
and
let me bring in.
Second hand, we have.
Let me bring in some of the
point.
others here. Azadeh Khan, your reaction to that avenue that could be explored. You just heard from Abbas.
Well, I just read it in the Iranian newspapers. This is another option, and it's too early to speculate on that. And certainly, I'm not a specialist of aviation, so I don't. Well, I think let's go back to the reasons that have led a lot of Iranians, middle-class Iranians, educated Iranians in the streets, because the Iranian authorities, I believe, committed a series of errors. Of course, the missile itself, and then presumably they knew that they had shot the plane with a missile. This is what one of the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards just told the press. He said, right on Wednesday, on the same day we knew that there was a missile. Now, why didn't they at least acknowledge that it was a missile that hit the plane? And then another error was, as was mentioned in the report, the same.
Is that what you're wondering? Why they didn't acknowledge it at the outset, or are you wondering why it is that they then came out and owned up to it?
Both. They came out and they acknowledged it 3 days later under international pressure, especially Canadian pressure, because a lot of people in the plane were Iranian Canadians. And this is one of the reasons why these educated Iranians are angry with their own government, saying, fortunately, Justin Trudeau was there to support us and to protect us. We are not protected by our own government. And another, very quickly, another error was that the government should have declared some days of mourning for these people in the airplane crash, which they didn't. And so the population is angry about this series of errors.
Georges Malbruno, when you go over the sequence of events since last Wednesday, what do you make of it?
I think there was probably also an internal fighting between those who want to hide the reality, probably some part of the Pasdaran, and in front of, we've seen very quickly, some ministries, transport ministry and foreign ministry, and so there was, as usual, as often in Iran, an internal fighting. And finally, those who advocated transparency won, and we had, after 3 days, said, but...
Because there was also a pointed criticism from conservative quarters. I can read you a tweet from the editor-in-chief at the Tasnim news agency, which has strong ties to the Revolutionary Guards. In it, he says that officials who misled the media are guilty too. We are ashamed before the people.
Yeah. The wave is very large of angriness, but. The question.
Are you surprised, though? So this is coming from the editor-in-chief of the Tasnim news agency?
Yeah, I've been surprised to see also Kayan, for example, receive very tough. Kayan is a very conservative. Shariat Madari is a close friend of the supreme leader, etc. So the wave is very large. The question we have to ask now is: we have seen for 3 days demonstrations, quite limited in terms of numbers, in terms of cities. Does the population is going to reach to gather with the students in the coming days? And we will see in the coming days. But this is a real question I think now we have to ask, because until now the regime is not panicking. The internet, Twitter has not been cut. So we'll see in the coming days how the situation is going to evolve.
Matthew Kronig, it's just on university campuses for now.
Well, that seems to be the case. And I would like to point out to your viewers that in addition to the titles you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I also worked for 2 years on the Iran desk in the U.S. Department of Defense, so Iran issues are something I've been following for some time. And your guest from Iran suggested that one possible explanation might be that this was a U.S. cyber attack that fooled the Iranians into shooting down this plane. I would just like to disabuse that hypothesis. I think there's absolutely no chance that the United States conducted a cyber attack like that. The Trump administration was quite pleased with the way this crisis played out, taking Soleimani off the battlefield and in exchange for just token Iranian retaliation. So the Trump administration wanted to see this crisis de-escalate, didn't want to see conflict continue, and certainly wouldn't want to shoot down a jet with Canadians and Ukrainians, close U.S. allies and partners.
But is it over? Because there's the sense that the other shoe hasn't dropped.
Good question. I think the immediate crisis has de-escalated. I think the major crisis is coming in about 6 months. Because one of the ways that Iran has announced it will retaliate is by ceasing to abide by the limits in the nuclear deal. And best outside estimates are that Iran's about 6 to 8 months away from a nuclear breakout capability. So if it continues to increase and ramp up its nuclear program, I think we could have a major crisis over an Iranian nuclear weapon sometime later this year.
Sometime later this year. Abbas Aslani, you agree?
Well, in relation to the, I think, nuclear deal, I think Iran took the fifth and the final step in terms of remedial actions in vis-a-vis the nuclear deal. And I'm not expecting in future and upcoming months a specific thing to happen in relation with the nuclear deal unless Europeans do something which might provoke Iran to fully withdraw from the nuclear deal. But I'm not seeing that condition and situation as of now. And I don't think that will happen in the near future. And in terms of what your guest said from the States, that Americans have not done the cyber attack, I think this is not something new. Americans shot down Iranian passenger plane in 1988, but they never admitted responsibility and they never offered apology for Iranians. And this time, I think this can be the case as well. If they have used any electronic warfare, I think they might not admit again and they might not take the responsibility for this action as well.
Georges Malbruno, very quickly, because we have to go to the break.
Yeah, I think I would like to come back what has been said. I think the killing of Soleimani came too early for Iran in their strategy in front of Donald Trump, because they are going to now to plan, I think, a crisis during the next summer. 2, 3 months, 4 months before the U.S. election. They want to get Donald Trump in trouble in order for the Americans not to elect him. Before the assassination of Soleimani, Iranian leadership was ready to talk to Trump in order to get their sanction lifted. Now, the option of talks are zero. So the other option, the only one option for Iran now, is to raise the tension, the pressure on the nuclear issue, in order to get a crisis, to get perhaps preemptive strikes, and in order for the Americans to realize that they have to elect someone else than Donald Trump.
All right, it brings us back to that killing of Qassem Suleimani. We'll talk about it when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're making sense of the pressure that's being brought to bear on Iran and the wider region. Talking about it with Georges Malbruno, senior correspondent for daily newspaper Le Figaro, Azadekian, who teaches at the University of Paris 7. Is that how you say it?
It's become University of Paris.
Just University of Paris now.
Huge university, yeah.
He's from Tehran, Abbas Aslani, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies, and from Washington, Georgetown University, Professor Matthew Gruning, former Iran desk person at the Defense Department, and his latest book, The Return of the Great Power Rivalry. Before the break, Georges Malbruno picking up on the point that the timing of all this has to do with elections in the United States. And there's the question after the death of Qassem Suleimani of whether he presented an imminent threat. Now, while doing the rounds of Sunday talk shows, the current U.S. Defense Secretary had to eventually roll back remarks he made on CBS television.
What the president said was he believed that it probably and could have been attacks against additional embassies. I shared that view. I know other members of the national security team shared that view. That's why I deployed thousands of American paratroopers to the Middle East to reinforce our embassy in Baghdad and other sites throughout the region.
Probably and could have been. That sounds more like an assessment than a specific, tangible threat with a decisive piece of intelligence.
Well, the president didn't say it was a tangible, he didn't cite a specific piece of evidence. What he said is he believed.
Are you saying there wasn't one?
I didn't see one with regard to 4 embassies. What I'm saying is I share the president's view that probably my expectation was they were going to go after our embassies. The embassies are the most prominent display of American presence in a country.
Matthew Groening, your reaction to those remarks?
I think to some degree this is a controversy without grounding. I think it's well known that Soleimani killed hundreds of Americans over the years.
But did he present an imminent
threat? I think it's also well known
threat?
that he was. I think it was obvious that after the U.S. strike on the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, after the attack on the embassy, that Soleimani was planning other attacks against the United States. Was it 4 embassies or not? My guess there is that the president was ad-libbing a little bit. He hasn't been known to stay on message. And so I think journalists are playing a little bit of got you politics here. But I think it's clear that Soleimani did pose a threat to U.S. allies' bases and in the region and was planning other attacks. And so taking him off the battlefield eliminated his ability to do that.
Do you buy that argument, Azadeh Khan?
Absolutely not. We're still waiting for proofs to show that Soleimani was planning attacks against the American embassies or interests in the region. And if Iraqis or Syrians or Yemenites or whatnots are attacking American interests in the region, it is because the United States is a hegemonic imperialist force in the region. And so these, with or without Soleimani, these forces and these people are going to fight against this American hegemony. I think that President Trump did a big mistake, and they can't prove it, that Soleimani was preparing something. Soleimani did not kill, is not responsible for the killing of hundreds of Americans. What Soleimani was doing in the region, first and foremost, was to fight against Daesh, against the Islamic States, when any coalition forces were not present yet. And then afterwards, he helped the Iraqis, militias, or Syrian militias to fight against the state. So it is not Soleimani who killed Americans. It is those groups that Soleimani and the Iranian regime support in the region that might be responsible for the killings of American soldiers who are in the region. And we can say the same thing for American soldiers, American military in the region that are responsible for the killings of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and of other people in the region. So, and Soleimani was not a terrorist. He was a general of this Iranian army, if you wish. And his assassination was very coward. He was not killed in a battle. He was assassinated. And this made him look like a very innocent martyr in Iran, which explains why hundreds of thousands of Iranians, many of whom are not for the regime, participated in his funerals. So I think that President Trump did a very, very bad mistake. And the U.S. is less secure in the region now than before Soleimani's death.
All right, there was a tweet earlier from Donald Trump, Georges Malbruno. He said the fake news media and their Democrat partners, capital P, are working hard to determine whether or not the future attack by terrorist Soleimani was imminent or not. And was my team in agreement? The answer to both is a strong yes, but it doesn't really matter because of his horrible past, he says. have we ever been in a situation like this before?
No, not before. But I think we have to think that we were all surprised by the Iranian retaliation a minima against American bases in Assad, and we're expecting much more retaliation. Apparently, now the messages which has been sent through the Swiss embassy in Tehran to the U.S. administration, it's the game is over, and for now, Iran against America. But I think we'll have to wait. We've heard yesterday Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut saying the goal of Iran is to expel the U.S. soldiers from Iraq and from the rest of the Middle East. They will not achieve it from the rest of the Middle East, but they have a good opportunity from Iraq to expel the U.S. soldiers, even though it will be difficult. So the first reaction could be there, even though I think, and I come back to my issue, the time is not ripe for a big retaliation, for a big escalade. I think the escalade will come later during summer, before the U.S. the U.S. election. And today we've seen a statement from Kataib Hezbollah, the strongest Iraqi Shia militia pro-Iranian, saying, okay, we give to the Iraqi government some months to diplomatically expel the U.S. soldiers. So we'll have some attacks probably against some bases with American soldiers inside, but I don't expect a huge retaliation. They will work on something different politically, and before probably the next summer, the crisis on the nuclear issue, because Iran will be free now to get up to 20%. We've seen last week Jean-Yves Le Drian saying
20% enriched uranium
arrangement. So the crisis will be there. And the question is, until when the US and the Israelis will accept this the nuclear pressure? And I think this is the scenario which has been made in Tehran.
Matthew Kronig, the Donald Trump in 2016 runs on a platform of bring the boys home and bring the soldiers home, not in favor of overseas wars. By killing Qassem Suleimani, is he going to be forced to be engaged more, not less, in external theaters?
Well, the president also campaigned on getting tougher with Iran and negotiating a new agreement. And I think what we've seen in the past couple of days is that the administration's strategy is making progress. The economic sanctions have really crushed Iran's economy. Iran's economy is suffering. Now there is a military component to the maximum pressure strategy as well. President Trump has made it clear that he's willing to use military force to push back on Iran's terror and proxies. And now we've seen the really historic protest inside Iran. So the Iranian regime right now is feeling intense pressure. And this is the kind of pressure that the maximum pressure campaign was meant to introduce. And it may just be enough to convince Iran to come back to the negotiating table to look for a way out of this very difficult situation that it's in.
Abbas Aslani, do you see negotiations in a near future? Could there be some kind of surprise twist?
Difficult.
What the impact of the recent actions by the United States, including the assassination of Qassem Suleimani, has been is that it has brought more anti-U.S. sentiments to the country. So in this situation, it will be a bit difficult to imagine that an official will be willing to go on to negotiate with the Americans at this moment, because this can cost him politically back at home. And so the chance of negotiations has decreased. I mean, some weeks ago, there were some mediation and some proposals at the table, and the Americans were ready to make it, but when the protests last month happened in Iran, Americans backtracked and they thought that it's not time to negotiate with Iran. Because why? Because they thought that the maximum pressure is working against Iran. but this doesn't seem to be contributing to the chance of negotiations. On the other also fronts as well, if the Americans wanted by assassinating Qassem Suleimani to change Iran's behavior and undermine Iran's foreign policy in the region, I think it has worked vice versa and other way around, and Iran has now more motivation in order to, let's go against the United States, and Iran has defined a long-term and strategic, let's say, goal, which is ending American presence in the region. Even if that doesn't happen after some time, at least Americans will have some challenges and problems in the region. So, and this doesn't help any, let's say, the chance of diplomacy. However, this can depend on in future that if we see any change in the approach of Americans toward Iran, and to avoid that maximum pressure, at that situation, we might be thinking about some talks or negotiations. Unless I think it will work the other way around and Iranians will be more decided to go against the policies of the United States in the region and in terms of the negotiations.
Azadeh, when you look at the protest movements that we've seen the past months in Lebanon, in Iraq, saying we're against all of them, basically, kick them all out. Is that all over for now?
It's not all over, just I think it's really temporary. But we see Iraqis, we saw Iranians who are against Iranian regime's presence in the region, because it also costs a lot of money, and due to economic crisis, Iranians want the money to be spent for them in Iran rather than abroad. But at the same time, what we saw is that with the assassination of General Soleimani, people who are in the streets to show their anger after the shutdown of the plane are no longer questioning Iran's presence in the region. It's something else they're questioning. They're questioning the leadership. They're questioning the fact that the leaders are not responsible. The fact that there is power relations, important power relations, that the opinion of the people is not really being taken seriously by the leaders, and so on. And I think that Soleimani's assassination was very counterproductive. If the aim of the states was to weaken Iran's influence in the region, what we see is that the influence has grown up.
But is that going to continue? Especially, I'm thinking about Iraq specifically.
What we've seen in Iraq, I was there a month and a half ago, huge anti-Iranian feeling. There was no protest against US. Now we've seen both, against US and against Iran. So in Iraq, I think the assassination of Qassem Suleimani was not very productive for the demonstrators. In Lebanon, it's something different. But I think Iran also should realize that its policy in the Arab world has reached a maximum of, how would you say, people are not happy in Kerbala, Najaf, etc. In the Shia, Iraq, they are not at all happy. They have to change the Iranian, their tool of action, because in Iraq there have been Qassem Soleimani was, as David Petro said, half CIA chief, half CENTCOM chief, and half special envoy of the president. So the Iranians went too far in their way of controlling Iraq. They have to change their policy. They went too far, recreating in the imaginary of the people the Persian Empire. So they have to change their way. And I think, and also it's also the same.
This has anything to do with this Persian Empire everybody's talking about. I think that Iranians want to secure. The Israeli regime wants to secure itself, and in order to secure itself, they think that the best way to do it is kind of to influence the region and influence their proxy groups in the region. And I think that the American policy really reinforced it, and it's going to reinforce. And something else is that these sanctions, American sanctions, are very counterproductive as well, because it is the Iranian society that has been targeted by these sanctions. Iranian regime has enriched uranium. Their missiles and ballistic missiles are there, so they are not really being overwhelmingly weakened by sanctions. The Iranians are, and even the middle classes are. And do you think that this is the only reason why? I mean, weekend people, those who are unemployed and so on, can topple a regime? I don't think so.
All right, we've been talking about how we've just gone through the last 2 weeks, incredible volatility in the region. And it was striking to see over the weekend world leaders converging on Oman to pay respects after the death of Sultan Qaboos bin Said. Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, among those meeting with the new Sultan, Haytham bin Tariq al Said. There was also Boris Johnson. France sent as its envoy former President Nicolas Sarkozy. There were many others. And it's all a reminder that it was Oman who played middleman in those secret talks between Tehran and Washington that led to a 2013 breakthrough in nuclear negotiations. Earlier, Matthew Kronig, you heard Georges Malbruno mention the historic role of the Swiss. But right now, who's keeping those back channels open?
Well, I think you've just identified the two biggest ones. The Swiss and Oman have been intermediaries between the United States and Iran in the past, and I think they'll continue to do that, even under new leadership in Oman. I would also just like to say that I think at some points in this discussion, we presented the U.S. and Iran as kind of equally culpable in this rivalry. I'd just like to point out that it was Iran that in recent weeks killed 1,500 of its own people. In protest, the Iranian regime fears its own people more than anyone else. That's one of the problems of autocracies. Iran also is under multiple UN Security Council resolutions because of its illegal ballistic missile program. Iran, according to the U.S. State Department, is also the world's largest state sponsor of terror. So I think the United States and Europe and France would be wise to work together to address this common challenge to
But it is the U.S. that unilaterally
security.
walked away from the 2015 nuclear deal and imposed effectively its rule on when it comes to sanctions on the Europeans.
Yes, well, the Iran nuclear deal was controversial within the United States. There was bipartisan opposition against it. I think people forget that. Every Republican and some Democrats in Congress opposed the deal. And so what the Trump administration wants is a deal that solves this problem in a more long-term basis. As you know, the Iran nuclear deal had sunset clauses that would have allowed Iran to ramp up its program. And so I know Europe had disagreed with the Trump administration on its decision to pull out of the deal, but we still face many common challenges that weren't covered in the deal, including terrorism and ballistic missiles. And it would make sense to see where we are now and to work together to try to solve these common challenges.
Just very briefly, Georges Malbruno, does France still hope to play a mediation role? I saw the comments were very measured.
No, I don't think so. I think now the ball is more in the court of the Swiss or Oman, Japan, Pakistan. The French role and the France was not very wise in the last weeks. In Iran now, the Europeans, as Abbas Aslani said, their role has been discredited because they took the side of Washington after the Qassem Suleimani's assassination. So I don't think we have to expect a huge European roles in the coming months.
How about Russia? I think Russia might also be able to play a role in that because Iranians listen to Russians and to Putin especially.
All right, we'll wait and see. Many thanks, Azadeh Khan. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank as well Georges Malbruno, Abbas Aslani for being with us from Tehran, Matthew Kronig in Washington. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. Just a quick look at how the protests in Iran have been playing out on social media. Lots of images going up on Twitter in particular of various scenes from, what we can see here is Sharif University with students chanting Iranian elite killed by the Islamic Republic. So there's a lot of very strong language directed against the leadership of the Republic. I haven't slept for 3 nights, writes Mohammad Mozaffari, who is an Iranian journalist. I'm so tired. Support the Iranian people. We do not want the Islamic Republic. So certainly that position is getting a lot of traction on social media. Of course, it's a divided picture. This is Iran News Wire, which is an Iranian sort of media which supports human rights and indeed is tweeting quite extensensively on the protests. They've also been showing images from similar protests or similar moments, calling the supreme leader Khamenei a liar. Some of those chants. The translation here of what is being played is: "We want transparency. This country hasn't seen transparency for years. They lied to us. State-run TV lied to us. They thought we were stupid." Now, on that point, this well-known news presenter for the Iranian state broadcaster resigned, and she did so very publicly and in a rather dramatic fashion, because of course state television was having to parrot the official line until the official line changed on what had happened vis-a-vis that crash. But she went further than just addressing that incident. She said, "I apologise for lying to you on TV for 13 years, which is essentially an admission that state television is completely muzzled and under control of the authorities." So that was a very dramatic moment, Francois, that got a lot of traction online. Also, even going further than that, the Tehran Association of Journalists decried the state of media in Iran. There's a quote here in the Washington Post relaying that information. "What endangers this society right now is not only missiles or military attacks, but a lack of free media." So certainly journalists and journalist organisations taking a strong stand about all of this. Also, actors such as Tarana Ali Dusti, hope that's correctly pronounced, she shared this image, just a black picture, which was a sign of mourning for after the plane crash. And along with that, she also said, "We are not citizens, but captives." So a very public stand being taken as well by that well-known Iranian actress. Now, in terms of censorship, because of Donald Trump's pressure and because of American sanctions, pressure was exerted on Twitter and Facebook to censor any material that would be seen as supportive of the Iranian position in this regard. Even the Supreme Leader Khamenei's account was temporarily suspended. It is now back up and running. He's tweeting again for anyone who's anxious to.
Suspended by who?
By Twitter, in fact. So, but under pressure. So that has been.
Twitter is forbidden in Iran, as you know.
Right.
And indeed
everybody has a VPN. So it's
can get around it, but there has been criticism of that censorship of not just Iranian Twitter accounts, Venezuelan as well, and other. The big tech giants said that this is the big tech giant, which is a reference to Facebook here, said that the censorship of users' free speech will be done in order to comply with Washington's suffocating sanctions on Iran. But a lot of criticism of what is seen as quite simply censorship of free speech in terms of supporting Donald Trump's and the US sanctions on Iran.
All right, many thanks for that, James Peden. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.